December 21st, 1944, 0530 hours. The frozen darkness outside Dom Bütgenbach, Belgium. A German SS officer studies the American positions through his field glasses. The snow-covered ridge ahead looks quiet, peaceful even, beneath the bitter, freezing fog of the Ardennes. His orders are clear and uncompromising. Break through the American line, seize the vital crossroads, and open the road west for the 6th SS Panzer Army. His Panzer Grenadiers are elite veterans, hardened by 3 years of the most brutal, unforgiving combat on the Eastern Front. They have survived the meat grinder of the Soviet artillery. They know how to fight, and more importantly, they know how to survive. The American infantry dug in ahead of them. To the Germans, they are just fresh troops, replacements, a temporary roadblock. This assault is supposed to be quick, violent, and decisive. But what none of the German officers in the Ardennes could have imagined that bitter morning was that the Americans possessed a weapon system so devastating and so precisely coordinated that it would completely transform the modern battlefield. It was a weapon that required no sci-fi technology, no secret invention, no advanced, untested machinery. It was, at its core, simply mathematics, timing, and an entirely new doctrine of ballistics. Within the next 8 hours, American artillery would fire more than 10,000 rounds into an area roughly the size of a few football fields. But it wasn't the sheer volume of high explosives that would shatter the German assault. It was something far more terrifying, something they had never experienced in years of total war, and something they had absolutely no counter for. Every single shell, fired from dozens of different guns, of different calibers, spread across miles of the Belgian countryside, would land at precisely the same second. This is the story of time on target, the artillery tactic that German prisoners simply called catastrophic. This is the story of how a handful of mathematicians at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, revolutionized the art of killing, and how an innovation built purely on ballistics and centralized command became the hammer that drove the steel spikes into the coffin of the Third Reich. To truly understand why time on target was such a revolutionary leap forward in military science, we have to understand the ballistics and the reality of artillery before its development. And that requires stepping back to the mud, the blood, and the horror of the First World War. On the Western Front, artillery reached its terrible apex. While machine guns often get the credit in popular memory for the slaughter of trench warfare, it was the guns, the massive, endless bombardments, that caused the vast majority of casualties. They turned the landscape into a lunar wasteland and turned young men into red mist. The numbers from the Great War are almost difficult to comprehend. On the very first day of the Battle of Somme, British artillery fired over 1.5 million shells at the German lines. Before the Battle of Verdun, the Germans fired more than 2 million shells in a span of just 12 hours. The earth physically shook miles away. But there was a fundamental, fatal flaw with all this raw killing power. Artillery fire, no matter how heavy, no matter how accurate, always gave the enemy a warning. Because of the way traditional artillery operated, a bombardment rarely began at maximum intensity. The first shells to land were ranging shots, spotter rounds used by forward observers to adjust the elevation and traverse of the guns. These initial impacts told the soldiers in the target zone exactly where the barrage was going to fall. Furthermore, shells traveling at supersonic speeds create a distinct acoustic signature. A competent, battle-hardened soldier could hear the incoming fire, calculate its rough trajectory based on the sound, and dive for cover before the shells impacted. The human survival instinct is incredibly powerful. Men learned to scatter instantly, to press themselves into the earth, to find deep dugouts or even just a slight depression in the mud. If you had even 5 or 10 seconds of warning, your chances of living through a high explosive strike increased exponentially. Because traditional artillery always provided that brief window of warning, the massive bombardments of World War I, despite their apocalyptic scale, routinely failed to destroy the defending forces. The Germans survived the week-long British bombardment before the Somme simply by retreating into dugouts that were 30 to 40 feet deep. When the shelling finally lifted, the universal signal that an infantry charge was coming, the Germans climbed up the stairs, manned their Maxim guns, and inflicted 60,000 casualties on the British in a single day. The problem wasn't a lack of explosive power. The problem was delivery. The element of surprise had been entirely removed from the ballistic equation. In the decade following the Great War, most armies looked at the slaughter and tried to forget the horror of industrial warfare. They returned to traditional doctrines. But a small group of American officers stationed at the Field Artillery School in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, began asking a radically different question. What if you could remove the warning entirely? What if the first thing the enemy heard was the simultaneous detonation of 100 high-explosive shells? In the late 1920s, Major Carlos Brewer, the director of the gunnery department, began developing new techniques for fire direction. His successor, Major Orlando Ward, pushed Brewer's concepts to their absolute limit. Between 1932 and 1934, they created what became known as the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. This was the paradigm shift. Historically, artillery batteries operated somewhat independently. A battery commander would spot a target, calculate the firing solution for his specific 4 or 6 guns, and fire. It was decentralized. The Fire Direction Center changed everything. Instead of independent guns, all firing data would flow through a centralized mathematical hub. It was one brain controlling dozens of localized arms. With centralized fire direction, an American artillery battalion could achieve something no other military force on Earth could match. The FDC could calculate the precise flight time of a shell from every single gun under their command, across vast distances. Let's break down the ballistics of what that actually means. Imagine you have Battery A located 3 miles from the target, and Battery B located 7 miles from the target. To make their shells hit the target at the exact same millisecond, you have to account for an immense number of variables. You have to calculate the differing flight times. You have to account for the difference in elevation between the guns and the target. You have to adjust for wind speed, barometric pressure, and air temperature, all of which alter the drag on the projectile in flight. You even have to account for the temperature of the propellant powder inside the casing, because powder that has been sitting in the hot sun burns faster and generates more pressure than powder sitting in the freezing snow, subtly changing the muzzle velocity. The Fire Direction Center processed all of this. They determined the exact trajectory and the exact second each individual gun needed to fire. Battery B, further away, might fire its shells at a high-angle trajectory. Battery A, closer in, might wait 20 seconds and fire on a flatter trajectory. The result? Every shell from both batteries arrives at the exact coordinate at the exact same moment. But doing the math in a classroom is one thing. Executing it in the chaos of combat is another. Time on target required infrastructure that had never existed before. It required absolute, unshakable trust between units that had never even trained together. It required a flawlessly maintained radio communication network. It required map makers and surveyors to create standardized grid systems so that a forward observer could call in a coordinate and every gun in the sector would immediately know exactly where that was. The Americans built this entire ecosystem. They developed pre-computed firing tables, essentially massive spreadsheets of ballistic data that allowed gunners to calculate complex trajectories in a matter of minutes rather than the hours it used to take. They pushed the power of artillery down the chain of command, training forward observers at the platoon level. This meant a 20-year-old infantry sergeant with a radio could summon the wrath of division-level artillery. Contrast this with the German doctrine of the time. German gunnery was undeniably legendary. The 88mm flak gun, for instance, is one of the most famous ballistic weapons in history. Their artillery was incredibly precise, but their doctrine was heavily reliant on careful pre-plotting by surveyors. It was exact, but it was rigid. It was slow. If an attack came from an unexpected direction, it might take German artillery batteries 10 to 15 minutes to mathematically reorient, calculate new firing solutions, and begin dropping shells. The American Fire Direction Center cut that response time down to under 3 minutes. For an infantry squad caught out in an open field, the difference between a 3-minute response time and a 15-minute response time is the difference between surviving to see tomorrow and bleeding to death in the snow. Which brings us back to that freezing morning in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Lieutenant Colonel Darrell M. Daniels' 2nd Battalion of the 26th Infantry Regiment was dug in around Dom Bütgenbach. They knew they were sitting on one of the most critical, vulnerable pieces of terrain in the northern Ardennes. Behind them lay the roads to Liège and the vital Allied supply lines. If the lines fell, the German offensive would break out into the open. In front of them, gathering in the darkness, was the full mechanized weight of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Daniel's men were exhausted. The 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, had been fighting almost continuously since they hit the beaches at Normandy. They had just emerged from the horrific tree-burst bloodbath of the Hurtgensorist. Many of the soldiers shivering in the foxholes were fresh replacements, young men who had never seen a shot fired in anger. Advancing against them were the elite of Hitler's Waffen-SS. These were veterans who had fought block by block in Stalingrad and survived the massive armored clashes of Kursk. The German attack came exactly as expected, violently and in the pre-dawn darkness. SS Panzer Grenadiers, supported by Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers and the terrifying wail of Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, charged through the deep snow toward the American positions. By all conventional military logic, it should have been an overwhelming slaughter. The Germans possessed numerical superiority, heavy armored support, and the sheer momentum of a surprise offensive. But what happened next became a legend among American artillerymen. General Clift Andrus, commanding the 1st Division Artillery, had access to an unprecedented concentration of firepower. He wasn't just directing his own division's 105mm howitzers. He had tied in the artillery of the 99th Infantry Regiment. He had heavy V-Corps reinforcing battalions, bringing massive 155mm long toms into the equation. In total, General Andrus could call upon 348 guns from 23 separate battalions. Every single one of them was pre-registered on the approaches to Dom Bütgenbach. Every single one was linked through the Fire Direction Center. Every single one was loaded, laid on target, and capable of executing a time-on-target mission. The first strike caught a massive German company completely in the open, slogging their way across a snow-covered field. Staff Sergeant Irvin Schwartz, manning a 57mm anti-tank gun on the American front line, watched as the counterattack arrived. The shells didn't come in one at a time. They didn't arrive in the staggered rolling waves that gave men a chance to dive into the snow. They arrived all at once. Over 100 artillery shells, ranging from 105 to 155 millimeters, ripped out of the sky and slammed into the earth within the exact same 3-second window. The effect wasn't just destructive, it was completely shattering. German soldiers who had survived years of the heaviest Soviet artillery barrages, who had endured Katyusha rocket strikes and massed bombardments on the Russian steppes, instantly broke and ran. They had never experienced anything like this. There was no whistle giving them 5 seconds to hit the dirt. There was no ranging shot. One moment they were advancing purposefully through the snow, rifles in hand. The next moment, the world simply ceased to exist. Men vanished. They weren't killed in the conventional sense. The overpressure and the intersecting blast waves disintegrated them. The sheer concussive force of over 100 simultaneous heavy artillery detonations was enough to stop a human heart without a piece of shrapnel ever touching them. Razor-sharp, jagged steel scythed through entire squads in the same microscopic instant. And then, before the smoke could even clear, it happened again. And again. Time after time, the disciplined German officers reformed their panicked men and ordered another attack, and time after time, the American artillery shattered their formations into red snow before they could even close within rifle range of the American infantry. The forward observers on the ridgeline, speaking quietly into their radios, called in target after target. The American positions became completely ringed with a shifting wall of high explosives. It was a curtain of steel and fire that the SS simply could not penetrate. By the end of the day, the positions around Bütgenbach, known forever after among the Americans as the Hot Corner, were littered with the shattered remnants of the 12th SS, one of the most elite, feared, and heavily armed formations in the entire German military apparatus had been stopped cold, not by an armored division, by a single American infantry battalion, backed by the terrifying mathematics of the Fire Directions Center. The next day, the Germans tried again. They received the exact same result. When American troops captured German prisoners in the aftermath, the veterans spoke of the American guns with something approaching religious awe. In interrogation after interrogation, they used the exact same word to describe the bombardments: catastrophic. They told their interrogators that they had felt safe. They believed they understood the rules of the battlefield. They knew how to survive artillery. You listened for the first rounds, you gauged the pattern of the impacts, and you took cover. But with time on target, there were no first rounds. There was no pattern to gauge. There was only a quiet sky, followed instantly by total, unavoidable annihilation. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Throughout the winter of 1944 and into 1945, German soldiers began outright refusing orders to advance during artillery bombardments. German officers wrote frantic reports stating that their best men, veterans of the Eastern Front who had fought hand-to-hand in the ruins of Stalingrad, would cower in their bunkers, refusing to step outside when American artillery spotter planes were active. The war diary of one German unit recorded that unit morale collapsed completely after experiencing just 3 time-on-target strikes in a single morning. The men were physically unbroken, but psychologically destroyed. They simply would not fight anymore. This was entirely new. This was something artillery had never truly achieved before in the history of warfare. It wasn't just about destroying the enemy's physical capacity to fight. It was about completely breaking their psychological will to exist on the battlefield. But the terrifying effectiveness of the American artillery wasn't just the result of time-on-target tactics. It was compounded by another major leap in ballistics and technology, a closely guarded secret that arrived just in time for the Ardennes offensive. To understand its impact, we have to look at the mechanics of a high-explosive shell. Traditional artillery shells were fitted with point-detonating fuses. They exploded when they physically struck something solid: the ground, a building, a vehicle. But Earth is remarkably good at absorbing explosive energy. When a shell hits the ground, it buries itself a few inches or even a few feet into the dirt before the fuse can detonate the main charge. The resulting explosion blasts the dirt and shrapnel upward and outward in a V-shape. Because of this trajectory, soldiers lying flat on the ground or hunkered down in shallow foxholes routinely survived ground bursts. The lethal fragments simply flew harmlessly over their heads. The American military sought to change this ballistic equation entirely, and the result was the proximity fuse, also known as the VT fuse. Developed in absolute Manhattan Project levels of secrecy by American and British scientists, the proximity fuse was an engineering miracle. They managed to build a miniature, fully functioning Doppler radar set powered by a tiny battery and fit it inside the nose cone of a 155mm artillery shell. Think about the physics required to make that work. They had to design fragile glass vacuum tubes that could survive the shock of being fired out of a cannon at thousands of G-forces while spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute and still actively emit and receive radio waves. As the shell descended toward the target, the radar continuously broadcast a signal. When those radio waves bounced off the solid earth below and returned to the fuse, the internal circuitry measured the time delay. Once the shell calculated that it was exactly 30 feet above the ground, it detonated the main explosive charge automatically. The results completely changed the nature of infantry combat. Instead of burying itself in the dirt and blasting upward, the shell burst in mid-air. It showered thousands of jagged steel fragments straight down at supersonic speeds. There was nowhere to hide. Trenches offered no protection. Sandbags were useless. Men pressed flat against the earth. Men who would have easily survived a traditional ground burst were shredded from above. Initially, the Pentagon was so terrified of this technology falling into enemy hands that they explicitly refused to allow the proximity fuse to be used over land. They only allowed it to be fired by the Navy over the open ocean to shoot down aircraft, ensuring that any dud shells sank to the bottom of the sea where the Germans could never recover and reverse engineer them. But the sheer desperation of the German Ardennes offensive changed that calculation overnight. General Eisenhower demanded that the ultimate weapon be released to the ground forces. On December 19th, 3 days after the massive German assault began, all restrictions on the proximity fuse were lifted. The devastating synergy of time-on-target tactics combined with the proximity fuse was fully realized on the night of December 25th. American artillery caught a full German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River near Echternach. The German battalion was caught in the open. The terrain was flat, exposed, and offered zero cover. The American Fire Direction Center coordinated a massive time-on-target strike, entirely utilizing proximity-fused shells. The shells arrived simultaneously, and instead of slamming into the frozen mud, they burst in a brilliant, terrifying canopy of fire 30 feet above the crossing. By actual confirmed count, 702 German soldiers died in that single, brief engagement. An entire battalion was effectively wiped off the order of battle in seconds. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was furiously racing north through the snow to relieve the besieged paratroopers at Bastogne, was famously hard to impress. But when he saw the results of the new artillery doctrine, he was almost giddy. In a letter to the War Department, Patton wrote excitedly about the new shell with the funny fuse and its devastating effects on the German infantry. "I think that when all armies get this shell," Patton wrote, "we will have to devise some new method of warfare." Combined with the mathematical perfection of time on target, American artillery had become something approaching a superweapon. German units caught in the open didn't just have slim odds of survival, they had no odds at all. This supreme dominance in ballistics reached its absolute culmination in the spring of 1945 as the Allied armies prepared to cross the Rhine River, the final formidable natural barrier protecting the German heartland. The scale of firepower assembled for the crossing was unlike anything the world had ever seen. For the U.S. Ninth Army's crossing, codenamed Operation Flashpoint, artillery planners assembled a staggering 2,070 artillery pieces along the western bank. The fire plan called for a perfectly synchronized, massive bombardment of the eastern bank designed to completely stun and paralyze the German defenders before the first canvas assault boats even touched the water. At exactly 1800 hours on March 23, 1945, the Fire Direction Centers initiated the sequence. Over 2,000 guns opened fire simultaneously. The sustained rate of fire was mathematically calculated at 1,000 rounds per minute. In the first hour of the bombardment alone, more than 65,000 high-explosive shells struck the German positions on the far bank. General William Simpson and Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stood on the western bank, watching as the far shore literally disappeared beneath a churning wall of smoke, earth, and fire. Winston Churchill, who had traveled to the front specifically to witness the crossing, watched the apocalyptic display of ballistics and turned to Eisenhower. "The German is whipped," Churchill said over the roar of the guns. "We've got him. He is all through." Churchill was right. The crossing succeeded beyond all Allied expectations. German resistance was sporadic, dazed, and confused. The German units that hadn't been physically obliterated by direct hits were so psychologically stunned and disorganized by the sheer, unremitting violence of the bombardment that many simply surrendered without firing a single shot at the advancing Americans. Within days, the Ninth Army had established a massive bridgehead 35 miles wide and 12 miles deep into the German homeland. Looking back at the end of the conflict, even the highest levels of the German High Command understood exactly what had broken them. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, observing the campaigns in Italy and Normandy, frequently commented on the Allies' tremendous superiority in artillery. He noted not just the outstandingly large supply of ammunition, but the absolute dominance of their fire control. Even the humble L-4 Grasshopper, a tiny, unarmed artillery spotter plane based on the civilian Piper Cub, became a symbol of sheer terror for the German army. These fabric-covered aircraft carried nothing but a radio and a highly trained forward observer. But because they were linked directly to the Fire Direction Center, that single man and that tiny plane could direct more highly accurate explosive power onto a target than a 4-engine B-29 heavy bomber. German soldiers quickly learned that if they saw a grasshopper circling lazily overhead, death was only minutes away. Accounts from the front lines describe entire German units scattering into the dense woods in sheer panic at the mere sound of the light aircraft's engine. One German soldier, captured during the fighting in France, described the American artillery doctrine with a mixture of absolute fear and grudging respect. The Americans, he explained, would immediately fall back and return fire when attacked, but then they would bring down a punishing, inescapable rain of artillery and instantly move to counterattack the second the bombardment ended. It was relentless, it was perfectly timed, it was completely overwhelming. Ernie Pyle, the legendary and beloved war correspondent who lived in the dirt and ultimately died alongside the infantry, put it in terms every soldier understood. "Our artillery," he wrote in 1944, "the Germans feared it almost more than anything we had." After the war, General Eisenhower himself paid tribute to the men who mastered the ballistics of the battlefield. He wrote that the speed, accuracy, and devastating power of American artillery won the absolute confidence of the troops it supported and inspired deep fear and respect in the enemy. The men back at Fort Sill in the 1930s, the quiet mathematicians, the meticulous gunners, the map makers who spent their days working on formulas on chalkboards, could not have fully known what their innovations would mean for the fate of the free world. They worked in the obscurity of peacetime. They developed complex mathematical techniques that most traditional military theorists completely ignored or dismissed as too complicated for the battlefield. They built a system that required no wonder weapons. It required no jet engines, no rockets, no splitting of the atom. It just required better thinking. It required a mastery of ballistics, geometry, and communication. And when the ultimate test came, when American forces went to war against the most experienced, tactically proficient army the world had ever seen, that mathematical system proved utterly decisive. The German soldier who froze in his foxhole outside Bütgenbach in December 1944, the SS Panzer Grenadier who thought he knew the rules of war, who thought he knew exactly how to survive an artillery barrage, learned the truth far too late. There was an entirely new way of war. The Americans had mastered the math, and nothing in the German soldiers' vast experience, nothing from the frozen steppes of the Eastern Front, nothing from the burning deserts of North Africa, nothing from the hedgerows of Normandy had prepared him for what came next. 100 heavy artillery shells arriving simultaneously, calculated to the exact fraction of a second, timed so flawlessly that the human ear could not even distinguish one deafening impact from another. This was time on target. This is how the American army truly fought and won the Second World War. And this is why, despite the terrible suffering, despite the bitter cold, and despite the tragic losses in the Ardennes, the final outcome of the Battle of the Bulge was never truly in doubt. Because when the terrible moment came to close with the enemy, the American infantryman knew something the German did not. He knew that help was only 3 minutes away. He knew that an inescapable wall of steel would fall out of a clear sky onto anyone who tried to attack his position. He knew that the guns and the math would always be there. On December 22, 1944, the battle at Bütgenbach ended. The 2nd Battalion of the 26th Infantry Regiment still held their frozen positions. The elite 12th SS Panzer Division had been entirely stopped. Its armored assault was broken against a combination of incredible American infantry courage and unrelenting American artillery mathematics. One single battalion holding the line against an entire SS Panzer Division, a feat made possible only by fire direction centers, pre-computed ballistic tables, and a uniquely American innovation in the science of war. General Eisenhower summarized the brutal reality of it better than anyone else ever could. The artillery was the hammer that drove the steel spikes into the coffin of the Third Reich. And looking at the ballistics, he wasn't wrong. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the math and mechanics of history's most devastating artillery tactic. What piece of military technology or ballistic history should we break down next? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. We'll see you next time on Empire Ballistics.